Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
With the fall of the Assad regime last December, you did see the withdrawal of the vast majority of Iranian-backed militia forces from the country, the sort of disintegration of the Iran-backed, as the Pentagon calls them, the Iran-backed threat networks in Syria. Whereas in Iraq, you still do have these factions on the ground, although they are significantly less willing to get engaged in standoffs at this time, following the major Iran-Israel conflict back in June. I would put my money on the Pentagon folks at U.S. Central Command made the decision to continue with the drawdown in Iraq, but to pause the one in Syria, factoring in the realization that the broader geopolitical environment, which now sees the United States and its allies reimposing snapback sanctions on Iran, that the risk to U.S. troops very well might increase once again at the hands of Iran-backed militias in Iraq, but in Syria the risk is lower.
Welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. The U.S. announced plans in April to withdraw about 1,000 troops from Syria, but Al Monitor reported this week that the plans are currently on hold. The pause is related to concerns the U.S. has about the Syrian government, led by jihadist rebel-turned-president Ahmed Ashara, to maintain stability following the bouts of sectarian violence earlier this year. The Trump administration has largely embraced Ashara, who led the overthrow of the Russia and Iran-backed President Bashar al-Assad last December. President Donald Trump removed sanctions on Syria earlier this year, and his envoy to the country, Tom Barrack, has been vocally supportive of Shara's efforts to stop the violence. Forces affiliated with Shara massacred more than 1,000 mostly Alawite civilians along the Syrian coast in March, and violence involving government, Bedouin, and Druze forces followed in July. Shara's government has pledged to hold the perpetrators accountable in both incidents, and is seeking to integrate former rebels, including foreign jihadists, into a new national army. Damascus is also working to implement a deal in which the U.S.-backed and Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, aka SDF, will join the new army. At the same time, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's government is in the middle of negotiations with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, aka PKK. Turkey considers the SDF to be the Syrian branch of the PKK and has opposed their presence in parts of Syria close to the Turkish border for years. In neighboring Iraq, a plan is currently in place to draw down the American presence throughout 2025 and 2026. In this episode, we'll hear from Al Monitor's Pentagon correspondent, Jared Zuba. Jared, who did the reporting on the U.S. troop levels, takes us through why the U.S. is concerned about Syria's fragility, whether the planned troop drawdown in Iraq will actually occur, and how the repositioning of U.S. forces in the two countries relates to the conflict with Iran. Hope you enjoy. Jared, welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief.
Adam, thank you for having me.
Jared, why is the U.S. concerned about the Syrian government being able to hold the country together amid the sectarian violence, and what is the U.S. assessment based on?
Yeah, Adam, it's likely based on a number of factors, not just intelligence, but events that we can see, with our own eyes that have transpired since the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime. You saw the extreme outburst of sectarian violence along the coast in Alawi majority areas earlier this year, and then you saw the fighting in Sueda and Daraa more recently, which numerous videos of extrajudicial killings, reportedly on sectarian lines. So there are a lot of questions, I think, as to whether Ahmed Ashara can control directly all of the factions that are aligned with his government. And, even if he could, the sort of coalition that he leads doesn't control much territory outside of the country's west, at least not very firmly. Now, the other major force in Syria on the ground is the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the self-styled umbrella for this militia, this alliance of militias led by Kurdish commanders who are affiliated with the Syrian branch of the PKK. Now, the Syrian Democratic Forces had an agreement in March with Damascus to unify their forces in an eventual post-war unified national force. But there has been little progress on that because of disagreements about how that is to be implemented, whether SDF units will be broken down and people will be individually recruited, or whether these units will remain intact, maintain their commanders, these sorts of issues. So very common source of dispute in these kinds of sort of integration of forces following a civil war like this. But it's something we should watch very closely because it's likely to be a bellwether for how much Damascus is willing to give and concede on minority autonomy in Syria, which is going to be a big part of balancing and keeping the country together. The other external factor I would watch is Turkey's negotiations with the PKK, which have been going on for some time now. There's no guarantees that Erdogan won't attack the SDF if the US leaves. That is likely to be, or I should say, American officials are waiting to see the outcomes of the political process in Turkey as well with the PKK to gain more assurances that Syria itself will be able to hold together and there won't be sort of external actors using internal sectarian fighting as an excuse to intervene and possibly exacerbate the country's stability more.
And Jared, given that Special Envoy to Syria Tom Barrack and the Trump administration have embraced this new Syrian government led by Shara, do you think there's a disconnect between the White House and the Pentagon on the approach to the country?
There certainly has been in the past, particularly in 2018, 2019, during the first Trump administration. I don't think that's the case at this time. All the sources that I've spoken to make no indication of that and, essentially brush that off. I think the Pentagon's primary concern in Syria is keeping those 9,000 ISIS fighters in detention and nearly 30,000 of their relatives, family members, from breaking out of the detainee and prison camps that are makeshift facilities that sort of dot the landscape of northeast Syria. Additionally, the U.S. objectives, which I think the Pentagon is very much in line with the Trump administration on, is preventing the return of Iranian forces to Syria, and quietly pressuring the Russian presence in the northwest in hopes that eventually the Russians will give up on a long-term military presence on the Mediterranean.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with Jared Zuba after this short break.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
Okay, we're back. Jared, shifting to neighboring Iraq, what is the current status of the U.S. troop drawdown over there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the U.S. forces, there have been very roughly 2,500 U.S. military personnel. The majority of them, advisors, some security forces for bases and the like. But the majority of them advisors, advising the Iraqi military on counter-ISIS operations. In the past several weeks, recent months, U.S. forces, U.S. personnel have been leaving the Ain al-Assad air base, which is the main base used by the United States forces in Al-Anbar province, sort of heartland of former ISIS territory. And they've also been leaving the Camp Victory complex in Baghdad. Some are going to remain at the U.S. Embassy, and possibly some, although it's not quite confirmed yet, at the JOKI, at the Joint Operations Center in Baghdad. But the vast majority of them are going to relocate up to Erbil. And when that transition is done in the coming weeks and months, there will be fewer than 2,000 U.S. troops left in Iraq. Now, this is occurring now as part of an agreement that was reached last year between the Biden administration and Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Soudani's government. And Prime Minister Soudani is facing re-election. His party is facing re-election, his coalition, in November. So it'll be interesting to see whether he can maintain his base of support among the coalition framework. There are a lot of questions about that, but certainly his administration is touting this U.S. drawdown and consolidation in Erbil as a win for diplomacy. Now, the Iraqi government, there's one point we should note about this. The Iraqi government has been touting this agreement for months. We knew this was coming. But the Iraqis have suggested that it's a two-phase drawdown. One is, the consolidation at Erbil in September 2025, followed by September 2026 with the withdrawal of all U.S. forces from Iraq. Now, U.S. officials I speak to, including a senior defense official just 2 nights ago, were absolutely adamant that there is no firm agreement now about September 2026, what that will look like, whether U.S. forces will leave. And in fact, several U.S. officials have told me that the discussions about next year and what will happen are ongoing. And after the elections, whether with Prime Minister Soudani's reelected government or with another Iraqi government, State Department and Pentagon officials intend to propose a future longer-term presence, whether in federal Iraq, but more likely based out of Erbil. So it's not likely that all U.S. troops are leaving the entirety of Iraq within the next year.
And Jared, finally, I want to conclude with something you alluded to earlier, which is the U.S. concerns about Iranian retrenchment in Syria. How do you think this repositioning of U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria is related to the conflict with Iran?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that, you asked the question about the U.S. government's concerns about the fragility of Syria and these ISIS prisons and all that. That's not, of course, the only factor that goes into a decision like this. One of the other major factors for the Trump administration is what the level of risk is to U.S. troops. U.S. personnel have been killed in Syria. They have been killed in Iraq, both in the fight against ISIS, but, more concerningly, at the hands of sort of rocket and missile attacks, which are very hard to defend against by Iran-backed militias that have links to the IRGC. So with the fall of the Assad regime last December, you did see the withdrawal of the vast majority of Iranian-backed militia forces from the country, a sort of disintegration of the Iran-backed, as the Pentagon calls them, the Iran-backed threat networks in Syria. Whereas in Iraq, you still do have these factions on the ground, although they are significantly less willing to get engaged in standoffs at this time, following the major Iran-Israel conflict back in June. So I think I would put my money on the Pentagon folks at U.S. Central Command made the decision to continue with the drawdown in Iraq, but to pause the one in Syria, factoring in the realization that that broader geopolitical environment, which now sees the United States and its allies reimposing snapback sanctions on Iran, that the risk to U.S. troops very well might increase once again at the hands of Iran-backed militias in Iraq. But in Syria, the risk is lower because of the withdrawal of the vast majority of these Iran-aligned forces.
Jared, thanks a lot for your time, and we look forward to more of your reporting from the Pentagon.
Thanks so much, Adam. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Be sure to follow Al Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.